All right, the last of our review videos for Unit 3 will cover language. Like religion, this should be a relatively short one. We tend to cover probably more than we need to when it comes to language, but it's interesting to me, so we cover it as much as we can. All right, so these are the two standards that you need to know for language. The first one has to do with basic terminology of language, language families, languages, dialects, world religions, ethnic cultures, and gender roles diffused from cultural hearts. The second one, diffusion of language families, including Indo-European, and religious patterns and distributions can be represented visually in maps, charts, and toponyms, which are the names of places, and in other representations. And you'll also find some discussion when it talks about syncretic elements of culture of things like pidgin languages and lingua francas and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that as well. All right, so in terms of languages, there are over 7,000 languages, or probably around 7,000 languages in the world. Half the world's population speaks one of 10 languages. So we tend to talk about and contrast in this little part of the unit the major world languages that are spoken most widely across the world, languages like English or various kind of Romance languages like Spanish and French, and also languages like Mandarin that are contrasted with more endangered languages or languages that are not widely spoken. So basically this breakdown of popular versus folk culture that we talked about in the last couple of videos. So languages are specifically defined as systems of communication through speech with shared meaning. And below that, you get what we call dialects, which are variant forms of language that have not lost mutual comprehension. So this is fairly, makes sense, I think. But English and Spanish would be two different languages because the two are not mutually comprehensible. Whereas different dialects of English, say American English versus Australian English, you would generally be able to understand the various dialects of the language. Although a dialect is distinctive enough for you to be able to label its speaker through vocabulary and pronunciation. So this is a map of what are called language families. So languages are one of the reasons I like languages, I think, are a lot of similarities to things like genealogy. So most languages in the world are part of larger language families, and you can see some of the major language families on the map. So we have the Indo, and you probably remember the big tree that we did some stuff with the Indo-European language family. But basically learning about how languages are related to each other. So you have most of the major European languages, languages of India, languages of Iran, all part of the same language family called Indo-European. So, and you can just see all of the different spreads of languages that are part of that family across the world. And you can think of also all the major ways in which those spread, things like colonialism and trade, and today increasingly things like the internet and popular culture, spreading language throughout the world. Other language families, you can kind of see we have languages like Hebrew and Arabic, part of the Afro-Asiatic language family. Most of the languages of China would be considered part of the Sino-Tibetan language family. Notably, I always think the Austronesian language family, which you can see a lot of disparate Pacific islands and islands in the Indian Ocean are part of the same language family. Then you can see some smaller ones as well, like Korean, and a few little dots around the world where languages are not part of a larger language family. So these are called isolate languages, like Basque is probably the most notable one. Basically the language of a group of people that live in northeast Spain and southwest France. So those are called orphan languages or language isolates. Yeah, so that's a rundown of kind of how languages are related to each other. Some other terms to think about in this unit. So we have the term lingua franca, which is a language that facilitates communication or trade between people who speak different languages. So lingua francas are often larger languages that are sort of the regional language. So if you think about kind of the lingua franca of the world itself would be English, because English is the most widely spoken language in the world, and probably the language that is spoken the most in terms of business. Although there's some disagreement as to whether English or Mandarin has more actual speakers, mostly depending on how you define the word speaker. But then if you zoom in, you'll see like Spanish as the lingua franca of Central and South America, Arabic as the lingua franca of the Middle East and Northern Africa. So different, Russian as the lingua franca of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So different languages serving as different lingua francas, sort of on a regional basis. We already talked about endangered languages a little bit. So the last thing I'll go over is the term pidgin language. So pidgin and creolized language are really, really close together. Basically, we talked about this and we saw some examples of what happens when languages come into contact with each other and something new, a new syncretic element of culture is formed that combines elements of different language. So oftentimes, again, there's sort of links to colonialism. Oftentimes, this will be a larger language like French or English, incorporating elements of smaller languages um, in order for people who speak the different languages to be able to communicate with each other. So this is called a pidgin language. And the only differentiation between Pidgin and Creole is basically Creole languages are Pidgin languages that have matured and developed their own rules and become more of a set official language. But Pidgin languages are really neat. We saw lots of examples, things like Haitian, Creole, uh, Hawaiian, Pidgin, all different examples of languages that have different languages sort of mushed together. All right, thanks.